Wir sprechen in Englisch. Ivan wird mit einem kurzen Input starten. Looking forward to hear you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity. And because I'm sure that this is not the first talk on Russia's war in Ukraine that you're hearing, I'll try basically in the beginning, just in 5-7 minutes, to try to answer 3 questions, and after that I want us to go for a discussion. And the questions that I want to ask myself, first one is, why we Europeans were so unable to believe that this war was possible? And I'm saying this because President Putin is lying about many things, but not about what he will do next. For anybody that have read his essay from the summer of 1991, Why the Russians and Ukrainians are the Same People, the probability of the war was very much there. And of course, even when the American intelligence starts to come, we were not ready to believe it. And from this point of view, my answer is that we were not ready to believe it, not because we have a particularly benign view of the Russian regime or the Russian president, but because this war is questioning the major assumptions on which European Union understanding of security was based. First, that economic interdependence is the major source of security. The war starts and you understand that economic interdependence can be the major source of vulnerability too. Secondly, for good reasons, we managed to convince ourselves that military power doesn't matter. And suddenly it appears that it doesn't matter when you don't have it. The day war started, Ukraine has ammunition for 6 weeks. Germany has ammunition for 2 days. And the third thing that also, in my view, made it very difficult for us to believe it, that the very understanding of Europe is a very special place where a major war is not possible, has been destroyed. The second question that I want to ask is why we were so unable to believe that Ukraine can resist. If you're trying to see, while there was a major difference between the Americans and Europeans of judging what Russia will do, both Americans and Europeans were sure that probably Russians in a period of weeks are going to take control over Ukraine, to the extent that Americans were afraid to give modern weapons to Ukraine because they didn't want them to end up with the Russians. Why we were so unable to understand that Ukraine has the capacity and the will to resist. And in my view, this is also an important question for Europe, because what you see also in Ukraine is the transformative power of civic nationalism. And for the European societies was very much socialized on the idea of post-heroic society. We have been trusting Brecht that we should feel pity for people and for nations that need heroes. Suddenly, this type of emergence of this heroic mobilization was a surprise. And my last question, and kind of a half answer, was why we have been so surprised that while most of countries in the world, of course, condemned when it comes to the UN voting Russia's war in Ukraine, when you see on the level of sanctions, when you see what basically practically they're doing, you're going to see that basically Western narrative of the war is not traveling well outside of the West, while countries like India, and I'm not mentioning China at all, but India, Brazil, countries that normally you believe should be on the democratic side, were very much trading with Russia much more than ever before. And part of my argument is that, well, people like to talk about what we are seeing here as the return of the Cold War. In a strange way, this war is also marking a major transition from this Cold War rhetoric to a much more post-colonial situation in which basically all these countries are seeing what they're seeing and saying, yes, the Russians are doing awful things, but how exceptional it is. And why it should be so important that it's happening in Europe. And I'm asking all these questions because as a result of this war, and this is why I do believe it's not a war in Europe, it's a war on Europe, the very identity of the European Union is going to be challenged to the same extent the Ukrainian identity has been challenged, and the Russian identity has been challenged.
So in a way, as you just mentioned, it's not a war in Europe or war on Europe, which is the question. You raised the question about Europe. So in a way, Europe can be thankful for the war, you say.
Thankful is not the word, yeah, to be absolutely honest. And listen, we try to talk about the war, and there is a lot of articles about military stuff. where troops are moving, how much ammunition, how much tanks. The level of destruction is incredible. And this is the scale of the destruction is something that, in my view, from time to time, we are missing on the level of what really is happening. The number of artillery shells that have been fired during this year on the Russian and the Ukrainian side is on the scale of the 1942. This is a major war. The level of the destruction which Russians imposed on some of the Ukrainian cities and others is amazing. In Mariupol, 90% of the buildings have been damaged. This is worse than Dresden after the bombing. So from this point of view, and secondly, more than 6-7 million people getting outside of the country and around 15 million basically being displaced. Around 15 million people are not living today in the places in which they have been living in the way the war started. This is big. This is the scale is something from time to time that we are missing because everybody is so much interested on the military part of it and not seeing basically the human dimension of what is happening.
The majority in the western part of Europe would not have expected the invasion. This was different maybe in Eastern Europe. Does this war unite Europe in a way?
For sure, in places like the Baltic republics or Poland, this war was much more expected than not expected. And this is one of the interesting stories about this war. This war brings back the long histories. Normally, when you talk about Eastern Europe, everybody was just much more focusing on the communist period. But then suddenly this war comes, and you're seeing basically the ghosts of the imperial mental maps coming back. By the way, Eastern Europe is not united when it comes to this war. Of course, some of the countries that stand most decisively behind Ukraine in this war are East European countries. You have the Poland, you have the Baltics, you have the Czech republics. If you go on the public opinion polls, some of the countries that are most Russia-friendly are also East European countries. My own country, Bulgaria, but also Slovakia. You can see Hungarian government basically being where it is. So paradoxically, this war bring a consolidation of European Union on the level of the elites that came as a surprise to many and also to the surprise of many Europeans. But at the same time, in a strange way, it divided Eastern Europe.
When the war started, a lot of people said this is the first war after 1945. You were part of the Balkan Commission and you wrote a very interesting essay facing the Balkan wars in the mirror of this war. Can you explain a little bit this fact that the war in Balkan was already forgotten?
Yeah, this was one interesting story. It was forgotten by us, basically. The Russians and President Putin is also basically trying to use the Balkan wars and particularly NATO war in Kosovo as trying to justify what he was doing, to the extent that when basically he was trying to justify the annexation of Crimea, he took just literal quotes from the declaration which the Western countries come for the recognition of Kosovo and put it in basically his declaration for annexation of Crimea. But the interesting story about the Yugoslav wars, and I can imagine that many of the people here are born after the war ended in a way. But one of the interesting stories was that when the war in the Balkans happened, there were three major differences which in my view are very important. This was the war that was perceived, in my view wrongly, but it was interpreted for most people as the wars coming from the past. It was not about Europe. The idea was on one level you have Europeanization, on the other you have Balkanization. Everything was expressed and interpreted through the ancient hatreds which you have in the Balkans. This is Balkan history. The saying goes that we in the Balkans produce more history than we can consume. This was the war from this point of view that makes Europe to look different from the Balkans. Europeans didn't really fear that this war can spread to them, and of course Yugoslavia is not Russia. The only fear in the first part, during the Bosnia war period, was how this war is going to affect the disintegration of the Soviet Union. So when all this is done, when the proliferation of the nuclear weapons have been taken care, when basically Ukraine and Kazakhstan and Belarus decided to give up their nuclear weapons, then suddenly it became a local war. And for the West, this was also the war, and this is the second important point, is that Yugoslav war, particularly the Kosovo part of it, because there were several kinds of Yugoslav wars, was meant to create a case how the next European order is going to look like. And very important and very smart British diplomat, Robert Cooper, he's famous for being described as the British diplomat with the license to think. Basically, he said that the fall of the Berlin Wall was dividing politics in the way the Berlin Wall itself was dividing East and West, and we are going to a totally different politics where there is no going to be sphere of influence and others. And it was about Europe. Everybody understands that outside of Europe, the world was very different, but there was a European order that was very different than this order. And this order was based when NATO basically started bombing in Kosovo. There were three things for which you cannot basically blame them. It was not about oil. There is no oil in Kosovo. There was not about major geostrategic story. And secondly, you go defending people who are not culturally like us. It was basically a Muslim place. And as a result of it, the idea was that this idea that sovereignty of individual is more important than sovereignty of the state, and that the Western power, particularly American military power, can impose this, was very much what this order was about. And suddenly now you can see that it was basically buried. It was buried in Ukraine. And from this point, you're comparing the Yugoslav prism and the Ukrainian one is critically important because it is going to show us that we are living in a totally different world than one basically of the late 1990s.
So to understand the war against Ukraine as a war against Europe, can you explain us the setup of Putin? Because you met him several times, you understand Russia as a language, you understand the Russian ideology when it comes to anti-liberalism.
It's interesting. First of all, as you know, in Germany you have a very specific idea of understanding Russia, so I don't believe that here understanding is the word. Listen, what you're seeing on the Russian side, this is not a war about territory. By the way, Russia is quite big. They have quite a lot of territory. This is very much about the war about identity, and in a certain way, this is a war which is based on the fact that Ukraine simply does not exist. Not simply the Ukrainian state, but the Ukrainian identity does not exist. And it has several sources of these policies. One is a very strong resentment to the way basically Putin believes that Russia was treated after the end of the Cold War. And for the Putin generation, and this is quite important, they never understood why Soviet Union collapsed. And listen, the question for them is how it happened that the nuclear superpower was defeated politically without being militarily defeated. How Soviet Union can disintegrate when it was one of the superpowers. And I was always making a small psychological point which was always very important for me. When Soviet Union started changing during Gorbachev, Putin was not living in Soviet Union, he was living in Germany, in GDR. As a result of it, I don't know how many of you have the experience being outside of your country when some dramatic change happens in your country. You simply cannot understand what is going on. Certain people that you basically believe that you know start to do things that you don't understand. So he came back with a not simply resentment, but he never understood what happened. And this idea of the betrayal, this idea that basically it was the West that used the naivete of the Soviet leaders and destroyed Soviet Union. Historically speaking, it was the decision of the Russian Federation to disintegrate Soviet Union. It was President Yeltsin and others who basically decided that Russia is not going to pay for some of the republics. Paradoxically, the Americans, till 1991, were very much afraid of the disintegration of the Soviet Union because of the nuclear proliferation. And what I don't know how many of you are very much interested in this, but to the extent that 10 days before the referendum on the independence of Ukraine, President Bush Sr., the father, went to Kiev and said, do not vote for independence. But listen, there are moments in history where people go on the street and what the diplomats and politicians think about don't matter. From this point of view, part of it was this. There is also one source of Putin's policy and Russia's aggression that is less discussed. And this is the demographic fear of the fact that Russia is shrinking demographically, losing people. By the way, 1 million deaths during the COVID, excessive deaths I'm talking about on the Russian side. And this fact that there are not enough Russians in the world, and that basically Russia is losing its status because of this, is particularly painful for President Putin, who was always very, very much interested in this demographic question. When he was first elected as a president, he basically claimed that increasing the Russian population is going to be critical for him. And I'm saying to you because just 3 months before the war, on several occasions, he was repeating one and the same phrase. He said, famous Russian scientist from 19th century, Dmitry Mendeleev, predicted that in year 2000 there are going to be 500 million Russians in the world. And he said because of revolution, because of the wars, there are only 150 million Russians. So because there are not enough Russians, in a way both Russians and Ukrainians should be Russians. And this is the story. This is something that I do believe he also believes. As a result of it, what happened to him. And this is, we can discuss, of course, more of this, but imagine there were 3 things that President Putin declared that the major goals of the war. One is he's going to liberate the Ukrainians. You can see basically how Ukrainians felt liberated by the Russian army. So this resistance made clear something that he never believed, that there is a Ukrainian identity and the people are really ready to die for their sovereign state. Secondly, he said he's doing this because he wants to stop the expansion of NATO. As a result of this war, Finland joined NATO. Probably Sweden will do it. As a result of it, the border between Russia and NATO has been increased by more than 1,000 kilometers. So the only thing now, and this is why it's war in Europe, that is important for the Russian president, and this comes very strongly also through some of the statesmen, the Foreign Minister Lavrov is, they said we're going to negotiate only if the negotiations is going to be about the nature of the next international order. It is not about Ukraine anymore. And I'm saying this because this kind of a fear of the world without Russia is something that is very much strongly pushing, have been pushing Putin to act. He also believed 2 things that turned to be wrong. One, by the way, could be also right, honestly speaking. He believed that the later he's going to do it, the cost is going to be higher, because he was seeing that basically the Ukrainian society and the Ukrainian state was becoming stronger. And secondly, he believes that President Biden, after withdrawing from Afghanistan, was not basically ready to act actively much in Europe, because America is totally refocusing on China. So I do believe this kind of a series of consideration explain the decisions and also what we are seeing unfolding in front of our eyes for the last year.
You wrote, empires are dying slowly. Is this what we are going to see in the next couple of months or years? That Russia is an empire, failed empire, is going to die, and it's the last war of an empire?
Listen, the empires are dying slowly, and also the place where the empires are born and the place that empires are buried is the bookshops. And one of the things that when President Putin was talking about, it was about Russia's world. And one of the major damage that he did, and the major source of this Russian world was, of course, Russian language, Russian culture. If you think what happened to the Russian culture and the Russian language as a result of this war, there was a lot of Ukrainians who basically were speaking Russian that have been communicating mostly in Russian, that have been reading a lot of Russians. And now basically, particularly if they come to places like Germany or Austria, for them not speaking Russian is a political statement. So suddenly the Russian language is becoming one of the major damage as a result of this war. When some years ago I was in a bookstore in Kiev, you're going to see a lot of Russian books. I'm sure that next time I'm going to be in a bookstore in Kiev, there's not going to be a single Russian book. So from this point of view, the perversity of this war is that everything that President Putin believed that he's doing this war for turned against it. At the same time, the unintended consequences of this war, how much it is changing basically Europe and the world, can go to the extent that for us is now difficult to predict.
So it basically turned against him also because of the role of the Americans, of the US. We can talk now about anti-imperialism, but maybe you can explain us the situation of weak Europe when the war started.
This is interesting because from time to time, the most difficult to explain is that the weakness of Europe was not the results of its failures, but of its successes. Europe was a post-war project. It is not by accident that Tony Judd called his book post-war, because it was not simply that Europe was born out of the experience of the World War II, but Europe was basically the international actor who believed that a major war is not possible here, that what matters is economic power and soft power. And as a result of it, most of the economic projects that were very much discussed, including the famous Nord Stream pipelines, they were not simply commercial projects. The idea was that we are going to trade with Russia so much that they are never going to attack us. And this was what, to be honest, Germans and everybody have been doing all the years, with everybody, with the French, with the Poles. The problem is it doesn't work. And as a result of it, the major change, and of course in Germany this is stronger than for anybody else, this also became an identity issue. When now European Union is not a post-war, when Europe is not post-war, who are we? And one of the things that also this war shows is that the moment this existential threat comes, first, you understand that it looks totally different in the Baltic republics, for example, or in Spain, which is on the other side of the continent. But also that while you can have a common European dreams, the nightmares are strictly national. And this is one of the paradoxes of this war. On one level, it pushed for much more stronger European unity and integration, and in this 1 year you see it happening. Even the decision on ammunition, or even on the common policies. But on the other, this war very much kind of have woken all the particular national traumas, all the long history, all these kind of imperial traumas, post-imperial traumas that this countries has. And don't forget something very important. European Union was created by empires, all with the exception of Luxembourg. All of the founding members of the European Union have been former empires, either acting like France or defeated like Germany. And the most important was that for them, starting Europe was basically turning their backs on the empires. All East European countries were born out of the disintegration of the empires. Their identity was strongly anti-imperial. So from this point of view, paradoxically, this war allowed, in this sense, Eastern Europe and Western Europe to stay together. And if during, for example, the Maidan or during the Orange Revolution, you have all these European flags in Kiev, now you have these Ukrainian flags basically in European capitals. So suddenly, European Union rediscovered itself as an anti-imperial force, which was not how it was born.
Let's look a little bit in the future. We have a crucial year next year in 2024. We have elections in the US, in Russia, in Ukraine, in the European Union. How much does it influence to succeed, to end the war or to find solutions?
This is, I could be wrong, in a way, even I hope I'm wrong. But I do believe that the only way to understand what is going to happen in 2023 is to try to see it from the perspective of 2024. And in 2024, you are going to have at least 5 elections that are going to have a critical importance for the dynamics of the war, for the possibility or impossibility for any type of negotiations. First, you're going to have the Russian presidential elections. They're going to take place, they're going to be played big, and the Chinese president already voted. He was in Moscow and he said that basically he knows that the Russian people are going to support Putin. By the way, this was quite important because in certain parts of the Russian elite, there was the talk that Putin can decide not to run. He's running, and the Russians are going to make a big issue out of this, that this is not simply a Putin's war, that the war has the support of the Russian population. How free or fair the elections are going to be, you can guess. The famous joke is that there are 2 things that Russians cannot choose: their parents and their president. But then they're going to be the Ukrainian elections, or at least they should be the Ukrainian elections according to the cycle. But it is a difficult decision for the Ukrainian side. First, there is a martial law. In the situation of the martial law, basically elections should not take place. But one of the reasons that President Putin is going really to make a huge focus on the Russian presidential elections is going to say, we have elections, let's see, can the Ukrainians go for elections? And first, having an elections when 20% of your territory is occupied is not easy. Secondly, it very much depends what is going to happen on the battleground, but this is going to be one of the major kind of ways to try to push it and to define what is happening. And if you're President Zelensky, you're not going to go for any type of negotiations if there are going to be presidential elections in Ukraine. Then you have a Taiwan presidential elections, which can turn to be critical for where China is going to stand. Because on one level, of course, this is not a China's war. Chinese has nothing against Americans spending most of their energy on Europe. But on the other side, for the Chinese, if they're going to be a strong pro-independence rhetoric on Taiwan, they could see a much more incentives, basically, to back Russia's much more actively in order to not allow the Americans to focus on Taiwan. Then you have European elections. This is not the most important elections that is happening in Europe, but this elections which is always giving a major advantage to the anti-system parties. And if President of the Commission von der Leyen is going to run for re-elections, of course everybody who is unhappy with the war and everybody who wants to oppose the policy of integrating Ukraine is going to be to use it. And then you have the American elections. And one of the things that makes me very skeptical that we are going to have any meaningful negotiations is that I cannot see the Russian president, unless Russia is going to be destroyed on the battlefield, going on a meaningful elections before American elections. Putin has all reasons to believe that a major change in the United States can be in Russia's favor. So from this point of view, he works with the idea that time now works for him. And while Russia has economic problems because of the sanctions, at least what experts claim is that in the next year and a half, 2 years, Russia has enough financial resources basically not to take the decisions on because of it. So this makes me very, very skeptical that we are going to have a meaningful process. You can have a certain negotiations here and there, but knowing President Putin and knowing his obsession with the West, I cannot see how he's not trying to use the war in Ukraine to try to basically diminish the chances of Biden to win.
Is there anything what makes you optimistic?
Listen, the first thing that makes me optimistic is that quite often my predictions are wrong. And this is a good source of optimism in general. The second thing that makes me optimistic is that regardless of our analysis, there's things that happen and they're much better than you expect. As I said, all these great experts expected that basically Ukrainians cannot survive for more than 5 weeks or 6 weeks. Everybody was talking about the guerrilla wars and so on. So from this point of view, people matter, and history is not an algorithm. And this very much depends on the will of the people, of the capacity of the people. And from this point of view, yeah, I prefer to be not necessarily optimistic. Bulgarians were not famous for being optimistic, but being hopeful.
Thank you very much, Ivan.